The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE marked the unraveling of the Achaemenid Empire, once the largest and most formidable empire the world had known. Darius III, facing the rapid advance of Alexander the Great, assembled a vast army drawn from across Persia's territories: elephants, cavalry, archers, and tens of thousands of infantry. The battlefield near modern-day Iraq was chosen and prepared by the Persians themselves, cleared to allow for the full use of their chariots and superior numbers. On paper, this should have been the moment the empire reaffirmed its dominance. Instead, it became the scene of irreversible collapse. Alexander approached with a force far smaller in number, but better trained, more disciplined, and driven by extraordinary momentum. His strategy was daring. He refused a frontal assault and instead drew Persian forces out of position with a calculated feint. As Darius reacted, gaps opened in his defensive lines, which Alexander exploited with a precise cavalry strike aimed directly at the heart of the enemy formation. Darius, seeing chaos unfold around him and believing the battle was lost, withdrew from the field. That decision triggered a chain reaction. Without their leader, the Persian troops lost cohesion, and what began as a tense standoff became a complete rout. The consequences of Gaugamela were immediate and severe. Although Darius escaped the battlefield, his authority was shattered. Satraps and local governors, sensing the shift in power, began defecting. Alexander's forces entered Babylon unopposed, then marched on to seize Susa and Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian world. The symbolic and strategic losses piled up rapidly. Within a year, Darius was overthrown by his own men, and Alexander crowned himself the rightful successor of the Achaemenid kings. What made Gaugamela so devastating was not just the military defeat, it was the psychological blow. The Persians had fought on ground of their choosing with overwhelming numbers, and still their power crumbled. The empire, long considered invincible, had been broken by speed, intellect, and a single moment of hesitation that history never allowed to be reversed.
The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE delivered a blow to the Roman Empire so profound that its effects reshaped the empire's ambitions for centuries. Rome had long sought to expand its frontier beyond the Rhine River, believing Germania could be brought under control just as Gaul had been. To oversee this effort, the empire appointed Publius Quintilius Varus, a seasoned administrator but not a battlefield commander. Trusting local leaders and assuming Roman dominance was unshakable, he marched 3 legions deep into unfamiliar territory, unaware that the very man he relied on, Arminius, was preparing an ambush from within. Arminius, a Germanic noble trained by the Romans and technically a citizen, had secretly united several Germanic tribes. Exploiting his insider knowledge, he convinced Varus to march through the forested terrain under the pretense of suppressing a rebellion. As the legions moved into the narrow, rain-soaked paths of the Teutoburg forest, they were strung out in a vulnerable line, burdened by wagons, civilians, and poor visibility. Over the course of several days, the ambush unfolded with ruthless precision. Roman soldiers were picked off in waves as panic spread, supply lines were cut, officers isolated, and no reinforcements could arrive in time. By the end of the slaughter, approximately 15,000 Roman troops had been lost. Their eagles, sacred legionary standards, were captured, a symbolic humiliation that shook the Roman psyche. News of the disaster reached Emperor Augustus, who was so disturbed that he reportedly cried out for Varus to return his legions. The loss didn't just stain Rome's pride, it changed its policy. Efforts to conquer Germania were immediately scaled back, and the Rhine River was accepted as a more permanent frontier. The idea of indefinite expansion, which had defined Rome's military ethos, was abruptly replaced with caution. What made the Teutoburg disaster unique was its blend of betrayal, overconfidence, and complete tactical collapse. Rome had been defeated in battle before, but rarely so utterly and unexpectedly. It revealed that even the most advanced military power of the age could falter when facing an enemy that understood both the terrain and the blind spots of empire. For the Germanic tribes, it was a moment of unity and resistance. For Rome, a lesson written not in theory, but in blood and silence among the trees.
The Battle of Kunyang in 23 CE was a turning point that shattered the fragile hold of the Xin dynasty, a short-lived regime that had interrupted the Han dynasty's rule over China.
Wang Mang, the usurper who founded the Xin, had claimed the mandate of heaven by promoting bold social reforms and presenting himself as a restorer of ancient virtue. But his policies quickly backfired. Land confiscations alienated the elite, while massive flooding of the Yellow River sparked famine and rebellion among the common people. As unrest spread, the legitimacy of his rule unraveled faster than his reforms could take effect. One of the many uprisings that emerged was led by the Liu clan, relatives of the former Han imperial family. Their forces, though initially small, gained strength quickly and positioned themselves as defenders of the old order. In the spring of 23 CE, Wang Mang sent a massive army of nearly 500,000 troops to crush this rebellion at the city of Kunyang in modern-day Hainan. The rebel forces defending Kunyang, however, numbered just around 10,000. The odds were absurdly imbalanced, but morale, strategy, and leadership would prove more decisive than numbers. The defenders of Kunyang used a mix of defensive tactics and psychological warfare. While a core force held the city walls, a smaller detachment launched a surprise attack on the enemy's camp, setting fires and sowing panic. The enormous Xin army, spread thin and poorly coordinated, collapsed under the sudden pressure. Believing they were being attacked by a much larger force, many of Wang Mang's soldiers fled. Others were cut down in the confusion. What had started as a siege ended in a complete rout, with the rebel victory transforming a regional uprising into a national movement. The fall of Kunyang triggered a domino effect. City after city defected from the Xin regime, and within months, Wang Mang's hold on power disintegrated. Eventually, he was overrun and removed during the capture of Chang'an, the imperial capital. The Han dynasty was soon restored under Emperor Guangwu, whose rise was made possible entirely by the astonishing success at Kunyang. This defeat stands out not for the scale of bloodshed, but for the sheer reversal it represented. The largest army in China at the time, backed by an emperor claiming divine authority, was undone by a small, determined rebel force. It was proof that in the face of discontent, numbers alone cannot uphold an empire built on shaky ground.
The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 marked a pivotal moment in the decline of the Byzantine Empire, not simply because of the loss on the battlefield, but because of the political unraveling it unleashed. At the time, the Byzantine state was already under pressure from external threats like the Seljuk Turks and internal divisions within the aristocracy and military. Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes believed a bold offensive could restore imperial prestige and push back the growing Turkish presence in Anatolia. Instead, his campaign ended in catastrophe. Romanus marched eastward with a large force drawn from across the empire, including mercenaries of various origins, many of whom had questionable loyalty. His opponent, the Seljuk ruler Alp Arslan, initially avoided open conflict, hoping to draw the Byzantines deep into hostile territory. When the two armies finally clashed near the fortress town of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, Romanos underestimated both the skill of the Seljuk horse archers and the precarious loyalty of his own commanders. The Byzantine lines were harassed and exhausted by feigned retreats. Then came the betrayal that sealed the empire's fate. Andronikos Doukas, a rival within Romanus's command structure, withdrew his troops at a critical moment. The collapse of cohesion within the Byzantine army turned a manageable engagement into a disastrous rout. Romanus himself was captured alive, a shocking and rare event for a reigning emperor. Although Alp Arslan treated him with surprising restraint and released him, the damage had already been done. Romanus returned to find himself overthrown, blinded, and replaced. The defeat not only broke the army, it shattered the imperial image of strength and control. In the aftermath, Turkish tribes poured into Anatolia with increasing ease. What had been the empire's heartland for centuries began to fragment into independent Turkish beyliks. Cities that had once been deeply Byzantine fell away, and the demographic shift that followed would permanently alter the region's identity. Manzikert wasn't just a lost battle. It was the beginning of a transformation that would make it nearly impossible for the Byzantines to fully recover.
The crushing defeat at Manzikert is remembered not simply because of the emperor's capture, but because of what it symbolized: a powerful empire losing its grip from within at the precise moment external pressure reached its peak. From that point forward, the Byzantine Empire would spend more time defending remnants than rebuilding its former greatness.
The Sack of Baghdad in 1258 by the Mongols marked one of the most devastating moments in Islamic history and delivered a final blow to the Abbasid Caliphate, which had once stood at the pinnacle of medieval civilization. For over 5 centuries, Baghdad had been not just a political capital, but a center of learning, science, philosophy, and culture. The Abbasids, though weakened by internal divisions and reduced territorial control, still symbolized a spiritual and intellectual authority that stretched across the Muslim world. That illusion of stability was violently erased when Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, turned his army toward the city. The Mongol campaign against the Islamic heartlands had been relentless and methodical. After conquering Persia and parts of Central Asia, Hulagu demanded Baghdad's submission. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, misjudged the threat. Relying on outdated prestige and hoping for divine favor or diplomatic rescue, he refused to surrender. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Mongols, known for their brutal efficiency and use of psychological warfare, besieged the city with overwhelming force. After just a few weeks of resistance, Baghdad's defenses crumbled. What followed was not a conventional conquest, but a calculated act of destruction. The city's population, including scholars, artisans, and civilians, was devastated. Libraries that had preserved centuries of knowledge, including the famed House of Wisdom, were destroyed. Legends speak of the Tigris River running dark with ink from countless manuscripts thrown into the water. Whether embellished or not, the image captured the symbolic end of an era. The Caliph himself was captured and reportedly executed in a manner intended to avoid spilling royal blood, a reflection of both Mongol customs and the grim irony that accompanied his downfall. The Abbasid lineage survived briefly in Cairo under the Mamelukes, but it was a shadow of its former self. Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, became a ghost of its former glory, its population decimated and infrastructure in ruins. The sack didn't just eliminate a ruling dynasty, it broke the cultural and intellectual continuity of a region that had led the world in many fields. It marked a shift in global power, with Islamic civilization no longer at the center of innovation and influence. The Mongols would soon convert to Islam themselves, but their conquest of Baghdad remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly centuries of grandeur can be erased in a single calculated campaign.
The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was more than just the end of a siege. It marked the collapse of the Aztec Empire and one of the most sudden and complete reversals of fortune in imperial history. At the beginning of the 16th century, Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering and urban planning, with grand temples, canals, marketplaces, and a population that rivaled any European city of the time. The Aztecs, ruled by Emperor Moctezuma II, had expanded their dominion through a complex network of alliances, warfare, and tributes that kept surrounding peoples under firm control. But that dominance bred resentment, and when Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast with a small group of Spanish soldiers, he found more allies than enemies among the locals. Cortés exploited divisions with stunning precision. By forging alliances with rival indigenous groups like the Tlaxcalans, he turned the internal discontent of the region into a powerful anti-Aztec coalition. Moctezuma's initial attempts to negotiate and contain the Spanish presence proved to be ineffective, and his decision to allow them into the capital, underestimating the threat they posed, was a fatal misstep. Eventually, tensions boiled over, leading to Moctezuma's removal from power and a dramatic retreat by the Spanish during the chaotic La Noche Triste. But Cortés regrouped. Over the course of a year, he returned with a far larger indigenous army and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. The city, surrounded by water and accessible only by causeways, had natural defenses. Yet over time, the combination of starvation, disease, particularly smallpox, and constant attacks broke the Aztec resistance. After 3 months of siege, the defenders could no longer hold the city. Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to escape, and what followed was systematic destruction. Tenochtitlan was razed. The canals were filled in, temples dismantled, and Spanish colonial rule was established on the ruins. What made the defeat so crushing was the speed and completeness of the collapse. Within just a few years, a mighty empire that had dominated central Mexico for a century vanished. The fall wasn't simply a military loss. It was a cultural and existential collapse that redefined an entire continent.
The Battle of Vienna in 1683 marked a dramatic turning point for the Ottoman Empire, a moment when centuries of relentless expansion into Europe came to a sudden halt. For nearly 300 years, the Ottomans had been pushing their borders westward, seizing vast territories in the Balkans and pressing against the frontiers of Christian Europe. By the late 17th century, the empire was confident enough to launch a massive campaign against Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy. The goal was clear: capture the city and open the way to dominate Central Europe. The siege began in July 1683 with a massive Ottoman force led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha encircling Vienna. The defenders, heavily outnumbered, braced for the worst as artillery battered the walls and Ottoman sappers tunneled beneath the city. Starvation and disease spread quickly inside. But while the Ottomans believed time was on their side, a coalition was forming to rescue the city, led by the Polish king Jan III Sobieski and bolstered by troops from the Holy Roman Empire and various German principalities. After 2 months of siege, the coalition army arrived and launched a counterattack from the hills surrounding Vienna. What followed was a stunning reversal. Despite their numerical advantage, the Ottomans were taken by surprise. Sobieski's famous cavalry charge, including the feared winged hussars, shattered the Ottoman flanks. Panic spread through the camp. Kara Mustafa ordered a retreat that quickly turned into a disorderly rout. The massive army that had once seemed unstoppable crumbled, and the siege was lifted in a single day. The consequences extended far beyond Vienna's walls. The defeat wasn't just a military setback. It symbolized the end of Ottoman expansion in Europe. The empire would never again launch a campaign of similar scale into the continent. Over the following decades, the Ottomans would be pushed steadily back, losing control over Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Balkans in a series of wars they could no longer afford or win. The Battle of Vienna is often remembered as a clash of civilizations, but more accurately, it was a moment when the limits of imperial ambition were laid bare. Overconfidence, logistical overstretch, and failure to adapt cost the Ottomans not only a battle, but their momentum as a European power. From that point forward, the empire would increasingly find itself on the defensive, struggling to maintain the borders it once had confidently expanded.
The Battle of Karnal in 1739 delivered a crushing blow to the Mughal Empire, exposing its deep internal decay and announcing to the world that its days as a dominant force in South Asia were nearing an end. Once the richest and most powerful empire in the region, the Mughals had grown complacent. Their court was opulent, their military large, but their bureaucracy was bloated, their finances strained, and their army increasingly outdated. Into this landscape of fragility stepped Nadir Shah of Persia, an ambitious, brilliant, and ruthless military commander who sought to expand his own empire and enrich his treasury. Nadir Shah's march into India was swift and nearly unopposed. The Mughal emperor, Muhammad Shah, eventually mobilized a massive army to meet the threat, believing superior numbers would suffice. The two forces met near Karnal, not far from Delhi. The Mughals fielded over 100,000 troops, while Nadir Shah's forces numbered fewer than half that. But the Persian army was better organized, disciplined, and armed with more advanced artillery and tactics. Nadir Shah also used clever deception, sending cavalry to provoke the Mughals into a poorly timed engagement. Once battle commenced, it became a massacre. Mughal forces, disorganized and led by self-interested nobles, quickly lost formation. Their elephant corps, once a feared component of the army, proved ineffective against Persian mobility. In a matter of hours, the Mughal front collapsed. The emperor's elite forces were overrun, his generals captured or killed, and his hopes of defending Delhi vanished. Rather than press the fight, Muhammad Shah surrendered and invited Nadir Shah to the capital. What followed was a spectacle of humiliation. Nadir Shah entered Delhi as a conqueror and initially promised restraint. But after a rumor of his assassination attempt triggered panic, his forces unleashed chaos. For several days, Delhi was subject to widespread violence and looting. Priceless treasures, including the legendary Peacock Throne and the Kohinoor Diamond, were taken to Persia. The city and the empire would never fully recover. The Battle of Karnal and its aftermath didn't just empty the Mughal treasury, it shattered the illusion of invincibility. Regional powers began asserting independence, and the empire slowly fragmented. The British East India Company, once a minor trading presence, watched closely, knowing that the balance of power had shifted. What made this defeat so severe wasn't only the battlefield loss, but the message it sent. That the Mughal Empire, despite its splendor, was hollow at the core, rich in gold, but poor in unity, direction, and the will to reform.
The retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1812 stands as one of the most catastrophic military collapses in European history, and marks the moment when Napoleon Bonaparte's vast empire began to unravel. By that point, Napoleon had dominated much of the continent, defeating coalitions of major powers and redrawing borders across Europe. His ambition seemed boundless, and when Tsar Alexander I of Russia began resisting the continental system, a blockade meant to cripple Britain's trade, Napoleon saw it as a betrayal that demanded overwhelming punishment. What followed was the Grand Armée's ill-fated march into Russia, a campaign that began with over 600,000 troops, the largest military force Europe had ever seen. Napoleon expected a quick victory, engage the Russian army in a decisive battle, seize Moscow, and force a favorable peace. Instead, the Russians refused direct confrontation, retreating deeper into the vast interior, burning villages and supplies as they went. This scorched earth policy denied the invaders food and shelter, even as disease, exhaustion, and desertion took a heavy toll. When Napoleon finally entered Moscow in September, he found it largely abandoned and in flames, set alight by its own citizens. There was no peace offer, no capitulation, only silence and a looming winter. With supply lines overstretched and morale crumbling, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. What followed was a nightmare. The Russian winter arrived early, and temperatures plunged. Starvation, frostbite, and constant harassment by Russian cavalry turned the retreat into a slow, frozen disaster. Men collapsed in the snow by the thousands. Horses died in droves, forcing soldiers to abandon artillery and wagons. River crossings became deadly bottlenecks. Units dissolved into chaos. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée staggered back across the Berezina River, barely 10% of the original force remained intact. Napoleon returned to Paris ahead of his men, already preparing to spin the disaster as a strategic withdrawal. But the damage was irreversible. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. Across Europe, former allies and defeated enemies now saw an opening. A new coalition rose against him, and within 2 years, Napoleon would face his first exile. What makes the Russian campaign such a monumental defeat is not just the staggering human cost, but its symbolism. An emperor brought low not by a single battle, but by overreach, hubris, and nature itself. The snow-covered roads of Russia became a graveyard not only for soldiers, but for the illusion of a European order under Napoleon's control. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the definitive end of the Spanish Empire and one of the most abrupt imperial collapses of the modern era. For centuries, Spain had ruled vast overseas territories spanning the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Though its global dominance had long since waned, it still held on to colonies like Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam.
By the late 19th century, however, these remnants of empire were more symbolic than strategic and increasingly difficult to control. When rebellion flared once again in Cuba, Spain responded with force, but the brutality of its counterinsurgency drew international outrage, especially in the United States. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor served as a tipping point. Though the cause of the explosion remains debated, American newspapers, driven by sensationalist headlines, blamed Spain and fanned public calls for war. The U.S. declared war in April 1898, and the conflict that followed was as brief as it was devastating for Spain. Despite centuries of naval tradition, Spain's fleets were outdated, underfunded, and poorly prepared for modern warfare. The defeats came swiftly. In the Caribbean, the U.S. Navy crushed the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey's forces destroyed the Spanish squadron at Manila Bay. On land, Spanish troops were overwhelmed in both Cuba and the Philippines, where American forces partnered with local insurgents. Facing mounting losses and no realistic path to victory, Spain sued for peace just months after the fighting began. The Treaty of Paris ended the war, and its terms were humiliating for Spain. It surrendered control of Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S., and sold the Philippines for $20 million. With that, Spain's status as a global empire vanished almost overnight. The loss wasn't merely territorial, it was psychological. A once great imperial power had been reduced to a minor player on the world stage, its prestige shattered. For the Spanish people, the defeat prompted a period of soul-searching and national identity crisis known as the Generation of '98. For the United States, the war marked its emergence as a new imperial force. But for Spain, it was the final chapter in a story that had begun with Columbus and ended with a brief, humiliating war that stripped away its last claims to global dominance. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was one of the most shocking military defeats in British history and signaled the irreversible decline of its empire in Asia. Singapore had long been touted as an impregnable fortress, a symbol of British technological superiority and colonial strength in the East. Its location at the tip of the Malay Peninsula made it a critical naval hub, guarding key shipping lanes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. To the world, it represented Britain's ability to project power across the globe. But when war in the Pacific erupted, that illusion was shattered with stunning speed. Japan's invasion of Malaya was swift, precise, and relentless. Instead of attacking Singapore from the sea, as the British had expected, Japanese forces advanced down the peninsula through dense jungle, using bicycles and light infantry to bypass fixed British defenses. Despite having more troops on paper, British and Commonwealth forces were ill-prepared, poorly coordinated, and outmaneuvered. The myth of racial superiority, which had sustained imperial confidence for generations, collided with the reality of Japanese tactical brilliance and air dominance. By the time the fighting reached the gates of Singapore, the situation had already spiraled out of control. British commanders, including General Arthur Percival, hesitated to mount a decisive defense. Japanese artillery bombarded the city from across the Johor Strait, and water supplies were at risk. Despite commanding nearly 85,000 troops, Percival surrendered to a Japanese force of roughly 35,000, a capitulation that stunned the world. The surrender marked the largest capitulation of British-led forces in history. Tens of thousands of troops were taken prisoner, including many from India and Australia. The fall sent shockwaves through colonial populations across Asia. For many, it was the moment the British Empire lost its aura of invincibility. Independence movements, especially in India, gained momentum as the empire's vulnerability became undeniable. Winston Churchill called the fall of Singapore the worst disaster and greatest surrender in British military history, and he wasn't exaggerating. Beyond the strategic loss, the symbolic damage was catastrophic. A cornerstone of Britain's global empire had crumbled in just over 2 months. What made this defeat so crushing wasn't just the military imbalance or tactical errors. It was the collapse of imperial confidence. The empire built on power, image,
and control had been exposed, and from that point forward, the sun would steadily begin to set on British rule in Asia.
The Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 marked not only a humiliating military retreat, but also the beginning of the end for one of the 20th century's most powerful empires. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, their leadership expected a quick and manageable intervention to stabilize a friendly regime in Kabul. What they encountered instead was a grinding guerrilla conflict that would stretch on for nearly a decade, draining resources, morale, and international credibility. At the heart of the miscalculation was the assumption that superior firepower in modern tactics could swiftly defeat the Mujahideen, a loosely organized but fiercely committed network of Afghan resistance fighters. But the mountainous terrain, tribal networks, and deep cultural resistance to foreign occupation made conventional Soviet warfare ineffective. Worse still, the Mujahideen received increasing support from abroad, particularly from the United States, which provided advanced weapons like Stinger missiles that neutralized Soviet air superiority. Soviet forces found themselves bogged down in a war with no front lines, no clear enemy leadership, and no path to victory. Villages were bombarded, civilians displaced, and thousands of young Soviet conscripts sent home in coffins. The war became deeply unpopular within the USSR, both among the public and within military ranks. Domestically, it intensified economic strain and sowed doubts about the competence of the communist leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev, recognizing the war's futility, initiated the withdrawal process in 1986 as part of a broader effort to reform the Soviet system. By February 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed the Amu Daria River, officially ending the occupation. What had begun as an assertion of strength concluded with a quiet retreat and a message broadcast to the world: the Red Army was not invincible. The aftermath was just as telling. The pro-Soviet Afghan government quickly began to collapse, and within a few years, civil war engulfed the country, ultimately paving the way for the rise of the Taliban. Back in the USSR, the conflict had exposed deep cracks in the Soviet system. Just 2 years after the withdrawal, the Soviet Union itself would dissolve, with many former republics citing Afghanistan as a clear example of imperial overreach. This defeat wasn't sealed by a single battle, but by attrition, underestimation, and the weight of ideology colliding with complex realities. Afghanistan became the graveyard not only of soldiers, but of the Soviet myth of control and permanence, a lesson in how empire can falter slowly, then all at once.